of the North of the Union and the South of the Confederacy. And of course, if one is one advantage, then of course it's probably the disadvantage for the other side in some degree. All right, first let's talk about the obvious thing is population. Because if you're going to war, the population would be a big indicator of how you're going to conduct a war. Population is a clear advantage for the North compared to the South. Here is the chart of it. If you look at the total population, you have 71% for the Union, which is represented here in blue, and the Confederates is represented at 29. And of that 29, you could almost say that 1/3 is enslaved or slave population. Okay, so that would cut that number down to probably roughly around 19-20%. And then for both sides, you can take the fact of women would make up half the population of that. So you can totally take a look. This is clearly a big advantage for the North when it comes to population, which is having an army, and we'll talk about raising an army and why people fight a little bit later on. Okay, if you come back over here, another big one is industry. Okay, and this would be the stuff I'd just be writing down in my notes, the little points underneath each side. Industry, the ability to produce supplies, which will be desperately needed in a time of war. And that also gives a clear advantage on the economic side of that too. 80% of the country's factories were in the North. 80% was in the North. If you look at this chart shows, like I said, is 86% compared to 14. And so those factories are producing a lot of different things. In some case, producing some type of maybe iron ore, which is used for weapons, or for equipment, firearms, which later we'll talk about. One key weapon or tool, which is the mini ball, which will greatly impact the production and how this war is going to be fought. Of course, gunpowder and the country's firearm. All right. Let's go now and look at finance. Look at finance here, the bank system, in which the bank here, the North banks, have the ability to take federal loans, and they had money. They also passed the Legal Tender Act, which will be part of those vocab words that need you to know. Legal Tender Act was signed in February 1862. Which this is going to create a national bank. You're going to have money, they'll issue money, and they'll eventually call it a term called greenback. The banking system in the South was not very good, and it continued to go down. Remember a long time ago we talked about how the plundered elite pretty much controlled everything. They did not have a good system for us conducting a war when it comes to the money side of things. If you go back here and also look, here is another big advantage, is the Navy. Okay, the Navy played a big part, because later on we'll talk about their strategy and so forth and the ability to blockade. But then the North have a strong naval tradition. 3/4 of the U.S. Navy officers were from the North. Okay, 3/4, and they also had a larger pool of trained soldiers which served as merchants. In earlier times, most of the New England and some of the middle colonies, but mainly New England colonies, were famous for their merchants. So they had experience. Most of the Navy warships, actually all but one, was under Union control. And so that is clearly an advantage, is having to do with how is the Navy being able to produce. All right. The next thing is railroad tracks. Now, railroad tracks is clearly going to be will be a clear advantage for the Union during the war. If you look at here, here's another 72% compared to 28%. And on these railroad tracks, The North is really, during the war, is going to start to be able to move troops and supplies, and they're going to use this to their advantage to be able to conduct a war. While the South, most of the railroad tracks are owned by private or business people who independently own them, which is really going to play a big part on the lack of the South being able to unify forward when it comes to rail. Now we're going to discuss some of the advantages for the South. And the first one is military colleges. 7 of the 8 military colleges were located in the South, and most of those, of course, was in Virginia. Which comes with that is there was a large number of trained officers ready to fight, and that being one that you saw in an earlier assignment with Robert E. Lee and some of those other guys. That these guys are trained, some of the best that they had, and they were on the side of the South. So clearly this is an advantage, the brilliance of these leaders, from these generals and these trained soldiers. Now this one is at first could be an advantage for the ability to produce food, and then I'm going to later tell you how it becomes a disadvantage. So at first, the South, known for agriculture, North was industry, and so the South is producing food. Well, here's the problem. The South could not get in the transition. They couldn't get away from making cash crops like cotton, okay, which is made for profit, to producing crops, which is used subsistence farming, which more than just feeding enough for your family, but feeding enough for your army. So they could not change from being a cash crop to producing crops that you can eat. And that is clearly will become a disadvantage for the South later on. Now, the advantage to a degree is knowing the land. Okay, home field advantage I put on here is knowing the terrain, knowing the layout of the land. And so you kind of fighting on your home turf. You're not going somewhere else. And also, in a way, it's easier to motivate people. If I can say, hey, look, guys, we're about to be attacked. I need you to come fight, protect your home, protect your land. It's easier to recruit someone to defend what you got than to go and take or go and try to beat something aside. So it's, in a way that, especially early on, is going to be a way in which the South will do that. I mentioned before already generals, Jackson and Longstreet and Lee, some of the great generals at that time. Now here clearly a disadvantage is a weak government. Now there's a few things if you would jot down about this. The North had the finance and they had ability to control trade and money and tariffs, and they can give loans. Well, the South planners bank, they would not buy bonds. They didn't want to be taxed. They refused to pay the taxes. And so you have that key word, what happens in the South when it comes to government and finance: inflation. Inflation got so bad by the end of the war, the South had experienced a 9,000% inflation compared to only an 80% in the North.